Ethan Vance never sought attention. He wasn't the kind of man who demanded the spotlight, who threw his weight around just because he could. No, he believed in quiet dignity, in letting actions speak louder than words. But on this particular flight, at 30,000 feet in the air, dignity was the last thing he was given. It started with a look, a hesitation, a flight attendant's polite but pointed skepticism. "Sir, I need to check your ticket." The words weren't unusual, but the way they were spoken, the way her eyes lingered just a second too long, told him everything. And before he knew it, he was being moved out of first class, out of the seat he had paid for, out of a space he had every right to be in. What the flight attendant didn't realize was that she wasn't just moving any passenger, she was making the worst mistake of her career. Because Ethan Vance wasn't just a schoolteacher taking a well-earned vacation. He was the owner of the airline. By the time she figured it out, it was already too late. Before we get into this jaw-dropping story of power, justice, and a lesson learned the hard way, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you love stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Now, let's dive into what really happened when one woman let her assumptions cost her everything. The hum of the airport was a familiar song, a melody of rolling suitcases, distant announcements, the chatter of travelers caught between destinations. Ethan Vance moved through it all with quiet purpose, the worn leather strap of his carry-on resting on his shoulder, the ticket tucked safely in his pocket like an old promise finally being fulfilled. It had been years since he allowed himself a break, years of pouring everything he had into his students, his school, his community, but today, just for a moment, he was giving himself permission to breathe. He approached the gate, his pace steady, his mind already settling into the thought of stretching out in a first-class seat, sipping a hot coffee as the plane cut through the sky. A small indulgence, but one well-earned. He had taught generations of children how to read, how to think, how to see the world beyond the limits placed upon them. But for so long, he had never given himself the same permission to step beyond his own routine. Today was different. Today was his. As he stepped onto the plane, the cool air inside brushed against his skin, carrying with it the scent of fresh upholstery and something faintly metallic, like the lingering touch of altitude before they had even left the ground. He found his seat easily. Row 2A, a comfortable window seat with a view of the runway stretching into infinity. With a practiced ease, he slid his bag beneath the seat in front of him, fastened his belt, and let his shoulders sink into the soft leather. For the first time in a long time, he felt still. And then, the shadow fell over him. "Sir, I need to check your ticket." The voice was firm, professional, but laced with something unspoken. Ethan looked up to find a flight attendant standing before him, her navy uniform crisp, her expression polite but tight, like a smile stretched too thin. He reached into his pocket and handed her the small slip of paper, watching as she barely glanced at it before raising an eyebrow. "This is for first class," she said. "Yes," Ethan replied evenly. A hesitation, a shift in weight from one foot to the other, a flicker in her eyes, a moment of calculation. "Are you sure this wasn't issued to you by mistake?" And there it was, the familiar, subtle hand of doubt, pressing against his presence, questioning his right to exist in this space. It wasn't loud, wasn't aggressive, but it was there, unmistakable, the way some people looked at him when he walked into a high-end restaurant, or when he pulled into a quiet suburban neighborhood. The question, always lingering beneath the surface, "Do you belong here?" Ethan exhaled slowly, measuring his response, keeping his voice calm and steady like the many times he had stood before a classroom of children, teaching them the power of their own words. "No mistake," he said. "I purchased it myself." The flight attendant's smile barely moved. "Right, I just need to confirm something in our system. Please step aside while I handle this." She motioned toward the galley. A silent command, not a request, not an apology. For a moment, Ethan considered pushing back, demanding that she check his ticket right there in front of everyone, forcing her to acknowledge what was obvious. But then he saw the way the other first-class passengers had shifted in their seats. Some turning slightly, some suddenly absorbed in their phones or magazines. The quiet agreement that this was happening, and no one was going to stop it. So, he nodded, unbuckled, stood. The aisle felt longer than it should have as he walked toward the front of the plane, past passengers who did not meet his eyes, He heard the murmurs begin, the low rustle of whispers moving through the cabin like a current. Unspoken but understood. In the galley, the flight attendant picked up the phone, her fingers tapping quickly against the buttons. Ethan could hear the irritation in her voice as she spoke in hushed tones, relaying something to whoever was on the other end. He didn't need to hear the words to know what was being said. Another pause, another stretch of silence. Then, she turned back to him with an exaggerated smile, the kind meant to smooth things over without truly acknowledging the mistake. "There seems to be an issue with your booking," she said. "We can offer you a seat in economy while we sort this out." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "There is no issue. My ticket is valid." Her smile thinned. "Sir, I don't want to repeat myself. Please take your things and move to economy." And there it was again, that quiet dismissal. The assumption that he wouldn't push back. That he would accept being moved without a fight. That he wouldn't want to make a scene. He looked at her for a long moment, searching her face for anything: hesitation, regret, a flicker of doubt. There was nothing. Without another word, he turned, walked back to his seat, and reached for his carry-on. The weight of the bag against his shoulder was nothing compared to the weight pressing against his chest. As he made his way down the aisle, he could feel the eyes on him, some filled with curiosity, others with quiet judgment, but no one spoke up. No one asked if he needed help. Ethan lowered himself into an empty seat in economy. The space tighter, the seat rougher, but it wasn't the downgrade that bothered him. It was the humiliation. His fingers hovered over his phone for a moment before he finally typed the message. "Boarded. Got moved to economy. Flight attendant refused to check my ticket properly." He hit send. A few seconds later, his phone vibrated. "What do you mean they moved you?" His gaze flickered toward the front of the plane. The flight attendant continued her duties, unaware of the mistake she had just made. Another message appeared. "Give me the flight number." Ethan typed it in. There was a long pause. Then, the final message came. "Sit tight. This isn't over." Ethan leaned back in his seat, staring out the small window. The hum of the engine filled the cabin. But his mind was elsewhere. He had spent his life teaching respect, fairness, and patience. Yet, here he was dismissed without question, without hesitation, as if he were invisible. The first-class passengers, the ones who had watched him be escorted away, went back to their conversations, their drinks, their comfort. No one had spoken up. No one had asked if he needed help. His phone buzzed again. Who was the attendant? Ethan sighed, rubbing his temple before typing back. Didn't catch her first name. Last name on her tag was Chandler. The reply came almost instantly. Noted. Ethan exhaled. He had no idea what was happening on the other end of that conversation. But he trusted it, and something told him this wasn't over. Not even close. The quiet hum of the plane was no longer just background noise. It was a weight pressing against the silence, stretching across the cabin like a veil, covering up the discomfort people refused to acknowledge. Ethan sat in his new seat, the space tighter, the air thinner, his presence smaller. He had spent his life teaching people to stand up, to challenge, to question. Yet here he was, pushed aside, staring out the window at a world that kept moving without hesitation. He could still feel the ghost of the leather first-class seat against his back. The way it had momentarily made him feel like he belonged in a world that didn't often pause to consider men like him. And now, the thin fabric of the economy seat was a reminder, a lesson that the rules, unwritten but deeply ingrained, still applied. Somewhere up front, Miss Chandler poured coffee, her motions smooth and unbothered, serving the same passengers who had watched without speaking when she escorted him away. Ethan wondered how many of them had taken a sip, sighed contentedly, and moved on. It was easy to pretend things like this didn't matter when they didn't happen to you. It was easy to let someone else's discomfort be the price of your peace. He had seen it in classrooms, when a child was singled out, made to feel small, and the rest of the students had looked down at their desks, suddenly fascinated by the scribbles in their notebooks. He had seen it in boardrooms when a brilliant idea was spoken too softly by the wrong voice and swallowed up by silence. He had seen it in grocery store lines, in the way clerks double-checked bills, in the glances exchanged between strangers who thought they were being subtle. A flight attendant moved past him, not Miss Chandler, but the younger one, the one who had hesitated. Sienna. Her name tag read, He had seen the way she had glanced at him when he was told to move. The slight furrow of her brow. The way her hands had tightened around the service cart as if she wanted to say something but didn't. She wasn't unkind, but she was something almost worse, silent. His phone vibrated again. "What gate are you landing at?" He checked the pocket in front of him, pulled out the small slip of paper from his boarding pass, and typed the number back. Another pause. Then, understood. Just stay put. Stay put. It wasn't just about this flight. It was a philosophy. A lesson hammered in over time. Don't stir the pot. Don't make a scene. Don't give them a reason. But Ethan had learned that sometimes, even when you did everything right, you still ended up here, sitting in a seat you hadn't chosen, forced into silence while everyone else moved on. In first class, the same empty seat he had been removed from sat waiting, its presence unremarkable to everyone but him. No one had rushed to fill it. No one had taken advantage of the mistake Miss Chandler had been so eager to correct. It sat there, untouched, like an unspoken acknowledgement of something no one wanted to name. And Ethan thought of how many times a space had been left open for him but not truly available. Up in the cockpit, Captain Rowan Hughes received an urgent message. It wasn't just a request, it was a demand for confirmation. He frowned, scrolling down the manifest until his eyes landed on the name. Ethan Vance. He read it again, his pulse picking up slightly, and then turned to his company pilot, who was watching with quiet curiosity. "Pull up the passenger details," Hughes said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. The co-pilot typed in the command, and the screen flickered before settling on the information. And then, just like that, the quiet order of the cabin, the routine of flight, the certainty of hierarchy, it all shifted. Back in economy, Ethan stared out the window, watching the sky stretch infinitely, feeling the strange weight of waiting. He had spent his life teaching patience, but patience had its limits. It wasn't just about the seat. It never had been. It was about all the times he had seen this story unfold before. The script so familiar he could predict every line. But something told him this time, the ending might be different. This time, someone else was holding the pen. There are moments in life when the air around you changes before you even realize what's happening. It's like stepping outside just before a storm. The sky thick with something unseen. The wind shifting in a way that makes the leaves whisper warnings. Ethan felt it before he saw it. A quiet shift in the energy around him. The flight attendant, Sienna, moved down the aisle, her hands slightly tenser than before, her eyes flicking forward as if waiting for something. Passengers stirred in their seats, shifting, adjusting, sensing that the rhythm of the flight so predictable, so routine was about to break. Up front, behind the locked cockpit doors, Captain Rowan Hughes wasn't just flying a plane anymore. He was handling a situation. His gaze moved between the passenger manifest and the urgent message flashing on the screen in front of him. Ethan Vance. He knew the name. More importantly, the airline knew the name. And if there was one unshakable rule in his line of work, it was this: when someone far above your pay grade asks for information, you don't hesitate, you confirm, you correct, and you ensure that by the time that plane lands, the mistake is already being undone. Back in economy, Ethan sat with his hands resting on his thighs, steady but aware. The hum of the engine filled the space around him, but his mind was miles away. He thought about his students, the way they came into his classroom on the first day of school, some eager, some wary, all waiting to see if they truly belonged. He had spent years teaching them that they did, that they were more than where they sat, more than how they were seen, more than the assumptions people placed on them. But here he was, staring out the window, forced to swallow a lesson he had long tried to unteach. Sienna passed by again, but this time, her hesitation was noticeable. She slowed just enough, the edges of her professionalism fraying as she met Ethan's eyes. He didn't need her to say anything, he could see it in her expression, the realization. The quiet guilt. She had stood by when it happened. She had let it happen. And now, the weight of that silence was pressing down on her, heavy and undeniable. A voice crackled over the intercom. "Miss Chandler, please report to the front of the cabin immediately." It was the captain's voice, steady but firm, carrying with it the authority of someone who knew exactly what was at stake. A few passengers lifted their heads, sensing that whatever was unfolding was bigger than the usual turbulence, bigger than the in-flight service or the routine announcements. Miss Chandler, who had spent years controlling spaces, deciding who belonged and who didn't, enforcing unspoken rules with the certainty of someone who had never had to question her own authority stiffened. The call wasn't a request. It was a summons. She smoothed the fabric of her uniform out of habit, lifted her chin, and walked toward the front of the plane. But the confidence that usually followed her movements was missing, replaced by something she hadn't felt in years: doubt. Ethan didn't turn to watch her go. He didn't need to. He had seen this story play out too many times before, the quiet reckoning that comes when someone realizes they've miscalculated. He kept his gaze on the window, the sky stretching endlessly beyond the glass. As the seconds passed and the plane held its course, the silence in the cabin deepened, passengers sensing something just beneath the surface, a tension they couldn't name but could feel in their bones. Then, the moment broke. Miss Chandler returned, but she wasn't walking with the same measured certainty. She was moving with the forced composure of someone trying to hold onto something that was already slipping through her fingers. She stopped beside Ethan's row, cleared her throat, and spoke in a tone that had been stripped of its authority. "Mr. Vance," she said, carefully, deliberately, "there's been a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to your original seat." The words hung in the air, fragile and exposed. The passengers who had pretended not to notice before were now fully aware. Their curiosity no longer masked. Some looked away. Others glanced between Ethan and Miss Chandler, sensing that something unspoken had shifted. Ethan turned to her slowly, his expression unreadable. He let the silence stretch just long enough to make her feel it, the weight of what she had done, the absurdity of it all. Then, he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "A misunderstanding?" Miss Chandler hesitated. "Yes," she said, her fingers tightening around the edges of the service cart beside her. "I regret the error." Ethan didn't move. He didn't rush to make it easier for her. He let the discomfort settle. Let the moment stretch. Let her sit in it. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he unbuckled his seatbelt, stood, and picked up his carry-on. As he walked past her, back toward first class, his voice carried just enough weight to linger in the space between them. "Funny," he said, his tone almost conversational. "I was asked to move pretty quickly. But when it came time to fix the mistake, it took a little longer." A murmur rippled through the economy section, the quiet truth of his words settling over the passengers like dust finally catching the light. Miss Chandler said nothing. She had nothing left to say. As Ethan stepped back into first class, reclaiming the seat that had been his all along, the air in the cabin felt different. The unspoken rule that had quietly dictated who belonged and who didn't had been broken. And for the first time, Miss Chandler felt something she wasn't used to feeling, not just accountability, but the weight of knowing that she had been seen, truly seen, for what she had done. The plane flew on, cutting through the sky, but down below, something had shifted. The ground was no longer where Miss Chandler had left it. And when they landed, she would have to find her footing all over again. The plane carried on as if nothing had happened, as if the thin air between the rows of seats wasn't buzzing with the quiet weight of what everyone had just witnessed. Miss Chandler walked back toward the front of the cabin, her posture rigid, her steps slower than before, as if each one was heavier than the last. She didn't meet the eyes of the passengers watching her, didn't acknowledge the quiet conversations that had started up again now that Ethan Vance was back where he belonged. She kept moving, past the crisp white linen draped tables of first class, past the passengers sipping champagne and scrolling through their phones, past the flight attendants who had seen her undo what she had done and now knew the truth. She had misjudged the wrong man. Ethan settled into his seat, but he didn't reach for a drink, didn't pick up the in-flight magazine or adjust his tray table. Instead, he let himself sit in the moment, feeling the hum of the engines beneath him, the subtle shift of the aircraft cutting through the sky. The thing about dignity, he had learned long ago, is that you don't have to prove you have it. You just have to refuse to let anyone take it from you. That was the real power. Not the ability to throw weight around, not the ability to command obedience, but the quiet, unwavering ability to stand your ground and let the truth speak for itself. Miss Chandler disappeared behind the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the plane. But the distance wasn't enough to erase the weight of what had happened. The cabin might have returned to its routine, stewards pouring drinks, passengers shifting in their seats, but something unspoken now lived in the space between them. There was an awareness now, a recognition of a moment that had started small, A simple exchange over a seat. And had turned into something no one on this flight would forget. And that was the thing about injustice. It often happened in silence. Swept under the rug, ignored in the name of not making a fuss. But when it was exposed, when it was dragged out into the light for everyone to see, people couldn't pretend they hadn't witnessed it. They couldn't unsee it. A man 2 rows ahead of Ethan cleared his throat and stole a glance at him before looking away. Across the aisle, a woman who had been pretending not to watch suddenly found her water glass very interesting. Even the flight attendants were quieter than before. Their movements less mechanical, more intentional. Nobody had spoken up when it mattered. And that silence, that choice, was its own kind of complicity. Ethan had seen it before. He had seen it in school board meetings when decisions were made about which students deserved more resources and which ones would have to make do. He had seen it in parent-teacher conferences, when the white mother of a struggling student was reassured that things would be fine, while the black mother of an equally struggling child was given a lecture on accountability and discipline. He had seen it in grocery stores, in business meetings, in the small, everyday moments where people made choices, sometimes conscious, sometimes not, to let the balance of power remain untouched. And today, he had seen it again, at 30,000 feet, in a space where people could pretend to be above the world but still carried their biases with them. His phone buzzed. He glanced down at the screen. Security and exec team waiting at the gate. Ethan exhaled slowly, pressing his thumb against the power button until the screen went dark. This wasn't over. Not yet. The final hour of the flight passed in an uneasy stillness, each mile bringing them closer to the moment when reality would come rushing back. The plane dipped lower, the descent beginning, the seatbelt sign dinging overhead. People adjusted their seats, stretched their legs, packed away their laptops and half-read books. But nobody spoke to Ethan. Not to apologize, not to acknowledge what had happened. And maybe that was the most telling thing of all. They had seen something wrong unfold right in front of them. Had watched a man be forced out of a seat he had every right to. Had listened to the quiet sharpness of his words when he was finally returned to it, and yet. Now, they sat in silence. The wheels touched the runway. The plane rumbling as it slowed. The familiar lurch forward as it made its way toward the gate. Miss Chandler remained unseen, behind the curtain, waiting for the moment she could slip off the plane unnoticed. But there would be no slipping away from this. There were things you could smooth over. Things you could explain away. But some mistakes followed you long after you made them. And Ethan knew that today. She had made one of those mistakes. The seatbelt sign blinked off. And the shuffle of movement began. People standing, stretching, reaching for their bags. Ethan didn't rush. He knew what was waiting for him at the gate. Knew that while Miss Chandler might be trying to disappear, there was nowhere for her to hide. The finality of it settled into his chest as he stood, collected his things, and stepped into the aisle. Up ahead, just beyond the glass, stood 2 uniformed men and a woman in a sharp suit. Arms crossed, expressions unreadable. Security, an executive, waiting. Miss Chandler hesitated near the front of the plane, her breath shallow, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. She had spent years commanding authority, walking through these aisles with absolute certainty. But today, she would walk off this plane with none. Ethan stepped forward, past the rows of passengers who had seen but had said nothing. Past the empty seat in first class that had been his all along. Past the curtain where Miss Chandler stood frozen in place. He didn't slow down, didn't turn to look at her, didn't give her the reassurance she might have been silently hoping for. Instead, as he reached the exit, he spoke just loudly enough for her to hear. "Next time," he said, his voice calm, steady, final. "Check the ticket before you check the person." And with that, he stepped onto the jet bridge, into the waiting arms of a world where power wasn't about how loudly you could command a space, but about how deeply your silence could echo. The wheels hit the runway with a firm jolt. But the real landing had already happened. Some moments fall out of the sky like thunder, cracking through the quiet and leaving a mark that no one can ignore. This was one of those moments. The plane slowed, the cabin filled with the rustling of people stretching, reaching for bags, adjusting their collars like they had somewhere urgent to be. But urgency had already passed them by. The moment to speak had come and gone. And now all that remained was the waiting, the silent, heavy waiting of people who knew something had happened but weren't sure what to do with the knowledge. The passengers were shifting in their seats, But the truth sat still. Ethan stood, slow and deliberate, feeling the press of eyes on him without having to turn. There was no applause, no sudden outburst of justice restored. The people who had watched him be escorted away, who had listened to Miss Chandler's clipped voice dismiss him to economy, still said nothing. Their silence had become its own presence. A quiet, guilty thing that followed him down the aisle as he stepped forward. Each footstep measured, each movement unhurried. Let them sit with it. Let them feel the weight of what it meant to witness something wrong and do nothing. Up ahead, just beyond the narrow door of the plane, the real world waited. Two men in navy suits. The kind who spoke in clipped tones and carried consequence in their pockets. Stood just beyond the jet bridge. A woman, sharp-eyed and stone-faced, was with them, arms crossed, watching the door like she was waiting for someone in particular. Not just someone, her, Miss Chandler. She lingered near the front of the cabin, her hand gripping the edge of the service cart as if it could hold her upright. The confidence she had wielded so effortlessly before, the authority that had wrapped around her like an ironed uniform, was gone. She knew, the moment the captain had called her up, the moment the air had changed. She had known, the people waiting outside weren't here for Ethan. They were here for her. Ethan didn't slow as he passed her. He didn't turn, didn't offer her the small kindness of eye contact or even the cold satisfaction of a final glance. He just walked, because that's what you do when you've already won. You move forward. You leave them standing in the wreckage of their own making. The moment he stepped onto the jet bridge, the air felt different, cooler, sharper, filled with the kind of expectation that only comes when people are bracing for impact. The woman in the suit stepped forward first. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice the kind that cut through noise like a blade. "We apologize for the inconvenience." Ethan nodded, but he didn't say it's fine because it wasn't. The taller of the two men glanced past him, and Ethan knew what he was looking for. He didn't have to turn to know that Miss Chandler had finally stepped off the plane. He didn't have to look to know that her steps were slow, heavy with the understanding that she had been seen, truly seen for what she had done. "Miss Chandler," the woman said, and her voice was colder now. Not cruel, just final. "If you'll come with us." The words landed between them like an iron gate slamming shut. Miss Chandler hesitated, but there was no escape now. The woman in the suit didn't step aside. The men in navy didn't offer any room for argument. This wasn't a conversation. This was a consequence. Passengers shuffled out behind them, pretending not to notice what was unfolding. But they noticed. People always notice when power shifts. When the rules they've taken for granted turn on them. They just don't always acknowledge it. Ethan took a deep breath, letting the cool air settle in his lungs as he walked away. This wasn't about revenge. It never had been. He had spent his life teaching people to think, to see the world for what it was and then decide what they were going to do about it. And today, Miss Chandler had been given a lesson she had never expected to learn. Not all lessons come with textbooks and clear answers. Some come in the form of silence stretching between strangers. Some come in the form of an empty seat that should have never been emptied. And some come at 30,000 feet, wrapped in a mistake too loud to be ignored. Ethan stepped into the terminal. The world moving around him. People rushing to gates. Rolling suitcases clicking against the tile. Life didn't stop for moments like these. But he knew, as he glanced once more at the glass doors leading out into the city beyond, that some moments followed you. And for Miss Chandler. For every passenger on that plane. For the people who had chosen to stay silent and for the ones who had finally learned what it meant to watch and do nothing, this moment would not be easily forgotten. The airport was alive with motion. A constant tide of travelers moving toward their destinations. But for some, the journey had already taken an unexpected turn. Ethan walked through the terminal, unhurried, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle into the rhythm of his steps. He didn't need to look back to know that Miss Chandler was being led through a different door. One that didn't open onto another flight, but onto accountability. There were moments in life that revealed the truth about a person, not the polished version they showed the world, but the quiet, unguarded choices they made when they thought no one of importance was watching. And today, Miss Chandler had been forced to confront hers. The gate agent, now suddenly all warmth and professionalism, called out his name. "Mr. Vance." "Sir, we deeply regret," but he raised a hand before she could finish. He wasn't interested in apologies wrapped in corporate polish. Wasn't looking for performative regret. Regret was easy. It came after the damage was done. What mattered was what people did before the moment of reckoning arrived. And most of the time, they did nothing. At baggage claim, an older man in a navy suit adjusted his tie and gave Ethan a nod. The kind of nod men gave when they wanted to acknowledge something without having to say the words. One row over. A woman with silver hair and pearl earrings kept her eyes down, rifling through her purse as though searching for something that didn't exist. And near the exit, a younger man, the same one who had turned his face away on the plane, lingered for a second too long. His phone in hand, his mouth opening just slightly before closing again. Ethan had seen this before. The quiet understanding that they had been part of something, had witnessed something they wished they could go back and change. The recognition that staying silent had been its own kind of decision. This wasn't about one flight. It never had been. It wasn't even about Miss Chandler. It was about the way the world operated on an unspoken system of assumptions. How those assumptions were rarely questioned unless someone like Ethan stood still long enough to make people uncomfortable. And discomfort, he had learned, was often the first step toward change. Outside, the air was thick with the heat rising off the pavement. A car pulled up, sleek and dark, its driver stepping out and opening the door before Ethan had even reached it. The assistant waiting inside handed him his phone, already knowing he'd need it. "They've handled it," she said, her voice neutral, but the subtext clear. The airline had already started its damage control. There would be statements, reassurances, policies reviewed, but the truth was, they weren't scrambling to fix the system. They were scrambling to fix the optics. Ethan leaned back into the leather seat, scrolling through his notifications, messages, emails, headlines already forming. Businessman mistaken for economy, passenger neutral words designed to smooth over the rough edges of what had really happened. Flight attendant under review after first class mix-up, as if it had been an error of logistics, rather than an assumption so deeply ingrained that it had felt like second nature. They would call it a misunderstanding because misunderstanding was softer than what it really was. But he knew the truth. And Miss Chandler knew it too. As the car pulled onto the highway, the city stretching out before him, Ethan closed his eyes for a moment and let himself exhale. He wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. He had learned long ago that justice wasn't always about the loud victories. Sometimes, it was about planting the kind of lesson that would take root and grow long after the moment had passed. He didn't need to see what happened to Miss Chandler next. He already knew. Because once you've been forced to face the truth of your own actions, you have to make a choice. You either change, or you carry the weight of knowing you should have. And some lessons, once learned, never leave you. The city pulsed with its usual rhythm, horns stretching into the air, voices rising and falling like waves, the hurried footsteps of people chasing the next thing. But for Ethan, there was no hurry. He moved through the streets with the patience of a man who had seen enough of the world to know that some moments deserved to linger. The weight of what had happened on that plane wasn't something he carried as a burden, but as a lesson not just for Miss Chandler, not just for the silent passengers, but for anyone who had ever found themselves in the kind of moment that revealed who they really were. At a small cafe on the corner, he ordered a coffee, black, no sugar, the way he had always liked it. The barista, a young woman with a bright smile and tired eyes, greeted him like she greeted everyone, with no assumptions, no hesitation. Ethan appreciated that more than she would ever know. He took his cup, found a seat near the window, and let himself watch the world move. People stepping in and out of buildings, catching cabs, scrolling through their phones, living their lives with no idea that somewhere, someone was still replaying the choices they had made just 30,000 feet above this very city. Miss Chandler, wherever she was feeling it now. That quiet reckoning, the moment when the adrenaline fades, when the excuses stop making sense, when you realize that your actions will outlive the moment itself. She had spent years in control, years deciding who fit and who didn't, who deserved kindness and who didn't. And now, she was learning what it felt like to be on the other side of that decision. Maybe she was sitting in an office, being questioned by a superior who could no longer ignore her mistake. Maybe she was pacing her apartment, replaying every word she had said, every assumption she had made. Maybe she was telling herself it wasn't her fault, that it was just a misunderstanding, that people like Ethan were too quick to call things unfair. Or maybe just maybe she was sitting in silence, facing the truth that had been waiting for her all along. Ethan had seen it before. He had watched it unfold in different places. In different ways. The coworker who had once dismissed his ideas but later called for advice. The parent who had doubted his teaching methods but then watched their child flourish under his care. The stranger in the boardroom who had spoken over him, only to later realize he had been the most qualified person in the room. The world had a way of making people face themselves, whether they were ready or not. His phone buzzed. A message. He read it, his expression unreadable, then slipped the phone back into his pocket. Somewhere across town, a statement was being drafted, carefully worded to ensure no blame, no liability. The airline would reaffirm their commitment to equality. They would implement additional training. They would address the unfortunate incident. The same cycle, over and over again, but statements didn't change people. Experiences did, and Ethan knew that the real change wouldn't come from a press release. It would come from what Miss Chandler did next. He sipped his coffee, letting the warmth settle. He had done what he always did, he had let the truth speak for itself. The rest was up to the world to decide. Would it move forward as if nothing had happened? Or would it remember? Would the next flight attendant pause before making an assumption? Would the next passenger speak up instead of looking away? Would Miss Chandler, the next time she saw someone who didn't fit her image of belonging, stop herself before opening her mouth? That was the thing about moments like this. They didn't always shake the world right away, but they planted something. And sometimes, the lesson that lingers the longest is the one that forces someone to see themselves in a way they never had before. Ethan finished his coffee, set the cup down, and stood. The city hadn't stopped moving. And neither would he. Ethan walked through the streets, past storefronts reflecting the soft glow of the setting sun, past the hum of a city settling into evening. Life, as always, had moved on. Planes continued to take off. People rushed to their destinations. And somewhere, another version of Miss Chandler was making another assumption about someone else. That was the way the world worked. Change did not come in a single, triumphant moment. It came in waves, small, slow-moving, sometimes unseen, but always present. He had spent his life teaching that to students who had been told they were powerless. He had taught them that resistance wasn't always loud, that sometimes the greatest act of defiance was simply standing your ground. Refusing to shrink, refusing to be erased. He thought about Miss Chandler. Not about what had happened to her that was already written, but about what she would do with it. Would she carry this day with her? Would she step onto another flight, meet another passenger who made her hesitate before assuming? Or would she push it away, let it harden into resentment, convince herself that she had been the victim? That was the thing about moments like this. They did not change people. They only forced them to make a choice. Some would learn, others wouldn't, but the lesson had been placed before her. And that was enough. At a crosswalk, a young man in a sharp suit was scrolling through his phone. So absorbed in whatever filled his screen that he nearly bumped into Ethan when the light changed. He looked up, startled, and for a brief second, their eyes met. A flicker of recognition passed over the man's face, not that he knew Ethan personally, but that he had seen something. A headline, a story, the way the internet had already turned Ethan into something bigger than himself. The young man hesitated, as if he might say something, then gave a small nod and kept walking. Ethan exhaled. That was how it always started. Quietly, uncertainly. He passed a coffee shop, its window glowing with warm light. And through the glass, he saw a woman at a table with her teenage son. She was speaking to him in a way that suggested she was explaining something, her hands moving in deliberate gestures. Her face serious but open. The boy was listening, really listening, his fingers absently stirring the straw in his drink. Ethan didn't need to hear the words to know the conversation. Somewhere, a mother was telling her child about fairness, about justice, about the things people see and the things they pretend not to. And maybe, just maybe, she was reminding him that when the moment came, he would have to decide whether to speak or to stay silent. The weight of history was not in grand speeches. It was not in dramatic confrontations. It was in the small, everyday choices that people made when no one was watching. It was in the way a father taught his son to respect people not because of their titles but because of their character. It was in the way a woman hesitated before dismissing a stranger. It was in the way a teacher, perhaps one of Ethan's former students, stood a little taller in a boardroom, knowing his worth, unwilling to let anyone question it. Miss Chandler had believed, for a moment, that she had the power to decide who belonged. But the truth was, no one carried that power alone. It was shared, passed from hand to hand, shaped by those willing to push against the edges of expectation. Ethan had never needed to raise his voice. He had only needed to hold his ground. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Another message, this one from an old friend. A former student who had gone on to do what Ethan had always known he would: change the world in his own quiet way. The message was simple. Saw what happened. Proud of you, Mr. Vance. Keep teaching. Ethan smiled, slid his phone back into his pocket, and kept walking, because the work was never done. And neither was he.